Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here in person, and thanks so much for everyone who's joining on the Zoom screens. And welcome to our conversation on Russia's invasion on Ukraine. Before I introduce our guests tonight, maybe one quick personal note. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Georgi Volevak. I'm an EC in Section B, and I was born in Kiev. I'm privileged because my family managed to move to Germany when I was a child, so I don't have any immediate relatives in Ukraine. But not everyone in our community has that privilege. There are Ukrainian students whose parents and loved ones are in the cities that are being bombed right now. There are other Eastern European students who fear that their countries may be next. And there are Russian students who feel shame and are afraid that people may start hating them, even though they oppose the war. They all need our support. We are speaking to the administration and we are working with them on relief efforts and immediate response efforts from the school. But there are things that each and every one of us can do. There were resources shared as part of the invitation to this event. There have been resources shared on Slack, on LinkedIn, and other channels. If you still feel like you need more support and don't know how to support, please reach out. We do have work for you. Everyone affected by the conflict really appreciates all the empathy each and every one of you has been showing. But at this moment in time, actions speak louder than words. We are at HBS, and HBS teaches us leadership, and we have an obligation to show that leadership when the time is there. And I believe that time is now. On a brighter note, educating ourselves and engaging in dialogue is a big part of engaging and learning about the war, which is why I'm very happy to have two distinguished guests with us tonight. Jonathan Powell served as the Chief of Staff to UK Prime Minister Tony Blair from 1997 to 2007. And in particular, he was the Chief British Government Negotiator for the Northern Ireland peace process. He's the author of bestsellers like Talking to Terrorists and serves as advisor to various heads of state on ending armed conflicts. And our very own Professor Deepak Malhotra teaches two courses in the EC, Negotiations and War and Peace. He's the author of works like Negotiating the Impossible, Negotiating Genius, and his latest work is called The Peacemaker's Code. His teaching, research, and advisory work focuses on negotiation, deal-making, conflict resolution, and diplomacy. And if that's not enough for you, he's also the Poets and Quants MBA Professor of the year 2020. Before I hand it over, one quick note on questions. Our two guests will speak for the first couple of minutes and then open it up to Q&A. You will have the opportunity to submit questions online. There will be a link posted once the Q&A begins. And for the Zoom folks, there will be a link posted in the chat function. And with that, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Powell and Professor Deepak Malhotra.
I'll get started. Thank you, Georgi. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the HBS Student Association for organizing this event. Let me just start by saying that the size of this room and the attendance in this room is testament to the fact that this is an important moment, and that the students that are in this room and the people that are joining us on Zoom appreciate the fact that as students, as citizens of the world, as future or current leaders, we have an obligation to ourselves and to our brothers and sisters around the world to understand what's going on and to ask difficult questions and to struggle with answers that are not always going to be straightforward. Anyone who tells you this is easy, here's the answer, here's the solution, here's what they should be doing, either doesn't understand the situation fully or has the same answer for every problem. We're going to try not to make that mistake. We're going to try to understand this, answer the questions the best we can. We have an hour and 15 minutes. There's no way you can do justice to this topic in an hour and 15 minutes. There's no way you can address every aspect of it, nor answer every question that you may have. So we're not going to make that promise. We're not going to make that our aspiration. But we are going to spend some time giving you our thoughts, how we think about what's going on some aspects of this conflict that we've been asked about from many people, from our students and from people outside of HBS. So we have some sense of the kinds of things people are thinking about. We're going to try to address some of those up front. We'll each talk for about 10 minutes on those topics. And then we're going to open it up for the rest of the time to all of you to send in your questions online. So that means people that are on Zoom can do the same thing. People that are in this room can certainly do that. And we'll try to get through as many as we can. In a situation like this, the most important thing to remember is that this is about people. This is about human beings who are suffering. And I say that up front because it's also our job to do as dispassionate of an analysis as we can about the situation. But I think we can do that without losing compassion or humility, both of which I think are very, very important as you're thinking about what somebody should do when any decision you make, any proposal you make has implications for someone's life, someone's family member, someone's well-being. We have to appreciate the fact that there are trade-offs. And so it might be easy for someone sitting thousands of miles away to say, do this, do this. At the end of the day, human beings are going to be affected. And we're going to try to do as dispassionate of an analysis as we can, but we're going to do it with some compassion because that is at the core of what we're trying to do is to solve a problem. And I think we're going to do it with some humility, appreciating the fact that we don't know everything. And even if we know things, we might be wrong in our analysis. The goal of this is not to share with you the answer. I tell my students in the War and Peace class all the time, the purpose of this is not for you to find out what I think. This is not about what I think or what Jonathan thinks. This is about how you think. And we're going to try to keep some of that framing in our discussion here as well. We're going to try to seed some ideas, share what we think about some aspects of it, but then we're also going to try to make sure that we all walk away, to the extent possible, perhaps understanding the situation a little bit better. So when we make our own stance on it, when we make our own judgment about what we agree or disagree with or support or don't support, it will be with a better understanding of all of the factors or more of the factors. With that, I'm going to have Jonathan start out and share some of his thoughts, and he'll do that for about 10 minutes. Then I'll do the same, and then we will open it up to all of you.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and thank you all for coming. As Georgi's introduction made clear, this is a really tragic situation, and one I find very difficult not to compulsively follow on the media every few seconds, refreshing my phone to see what's happened last, and quite often bursting into tears. And I've seen quite a lot of conflicts in my life. It's the bravery of the Ukrainian people, the bravery of President Zelensky is quite extraordinary. And I fear the next few days, because as President Putin becomes more and more frustrated with his inability to advance, the people who are going to pay the cost are the people of Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kiev itself, as the attacks become more and more indiscriminate. So I wanted to start by saying it's difficult to separate the analysis of this from emotions. And the situation is extremely fluid. We've no idea quite how this is going to develop, quite how it's going to end. But my experience of armed conflicts is they usually end with a negotiation. You don't know when the negotiation comes or what form it will take. We might want it to end with President Putin in jail, and maybe it will end with a trial at The Hague. I particularly liked what the Ukrainian opposition have been doing across the country, which is painting over signposts, because the Russian army don't use sat-navs, and painting the word The Hague into every single direction that they might go in. But I think it will be more likely we're going to end up with negotiations. We don't know what form they'll take, but I want to just very briefly, in my 10 minutes, describe some of the possible parameters of such negotiations. I have worked in the past in the Ukraine on negotiations there. I hope I can help again if and when negotiations start. And let me just start with Putin himself. I first met Putin in December 1999. Tony Blair went to visit Putin when he was first running for president, before any other leader had met him. After Yeltsin, who had been a brave but chaotic leader, Putin looked like someone who was going to be a reformer, a new approach in Russia, someone who was going to try and work with the West. Even on 9/11, the day of 9/11, I remember Putin called Tony Blair because he couldn't get through to George Bush, who was flying around the US in Air Force One. He offered to help. He offered to share intelligence. He wanted to know what he should do. A few weeks after that, we went to visit Moscow and had a session with Putin. Again, he offered basing. He offered more help in dealing with 9/11. I remember Tony Blair went back to his house and played pool with him. They took a joint call with George Bush together. But every time we visited him after that, after 2001, it was striking how hubris had set in, how he was had more and more servants, more luxury in the way that he lived. He was becoming more and more cut off. In 2007, Tony Blair had his last meeting with Putin in the margins of the the G8 summit in Germany by the Baltic coast. And Tony decided to have a last meeting with Putin by himself. So it was the two of them, a Russian interpreter and me. And Tony Blair decided to make it clear to him what he thought about murdering people on our streets using nuclear material and about his autocracy. And I have to say that Putin in response was extremely harsh, saying, you don't care if we kill dissidents on your streets, and launching into a diatribe about democratic politics. I could see this one someone who had changed dramatically from what we'd hoped it was when we first saw him. And now, 22 years later in power and autocracy, 2 years of COVID cut off by himself, he has become even more hubristic, even more unrealistic. I think it's probably wrong to say that he's mad. I heard Khodorkovsky, the former oligarch who spent 10 years in jail and had his company taken away from him by Putin this morning, describing Putin as not mad, but living in an alternative reality. He genuinely believed that the people of Ukraine would welcome him in these circumstances. Putin tells a rather unattractive story about himself and how, as a child, living in a very dilapidated skyrise, a tall building when he was young, used to spend his time on the landing of the building killing rats with a stick. And he describes a cornered rat, a particularly large one, when he tried to kill it, jumping onto his head and trying to scratch him. And I think that's an image that stays in my mind when I think of Putin now, who's overreached, who has no way back. And whatever we may think about him, what we need to try and do is make sure there is still an off-ramp. There has to be something that would stop him doing the killing, something that he can retreat down, given the circumstances he finds himself. And of course, we have a dilemma in that, because we want him to stop the killing, but we don't want him to be rewarded in any way for what he's done. We do not want to encourage him to make the mistakes of 38 all over again. So I think we have to think about the negotiations in those terms. What we feel emotionally is one thing, but we also want the fighting to stop. Now, the Ukrainian negotiations themselves, the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky is, I think very wisely, still engaging with the Russians. There were supposed to be talks today. They're actually going to take place tomorrow now, near the Belarusian border. The Russian delegation doesn't fill one with much hope. It's headed by a former culture minister, an extreme nationalist, who is certainly not a decision maker. He is also setting very clear demands for the ultimatum the Russians have set, and I think our expectations of any progress in those negotiations must be very slim indeed. The Minsk agreement, which was reached after the 2014 invasion, is dead. It was a mistake at the time. The Ukrainians allowed themselves to be trapped into an agreement they could never implement. The sequence of steps that were demanded would never be accepted by the Ukrainian people. And it's enormously important that mistake is not made again under pressure. The Normandy format that's been used for the negotiations since then, I think, is also dead. We will need a new format for negotiations when they start. The agenda that the Russians have put down is clearly unacceptable, demanding neutrality of Ukraine, the demilitarization of Ukraine, bizarrely, the denazification of a country headed by a Jewish president, that Ukraine accepts and acknowledges the occupation of Crimea and that it belongs to Russia, and the same for Luhansk and Donetsk. In return, what the Ukrainians are asking for is an immediate ceasefire and a removal of Russian forces. There is no mediator, and I think there is, at the moment, sadly, very little prospect of success. The other element I think we can expect in negotiations is the attempt by people to be a third party. In Georgia, in 2008, after the blitzkrieg of 5 days that Putin launched there, President Sarkozy of France flew in with a 7-point plan trying to reconcile the differences between the sides and managed to stop the fighting, but again at a cost of Georgia surrendering some of its sovereignty. President Macron has been trying to do similar things in the case of Ukraine. I think the experience he's had dealing with Putin over the last days means he won't be trying much more on that. And there's now speculation China as a mediator, which I find quite hard to imagine. There is, to finish, a wider question on negotiations, because this isn't all just about Ukraine. It's also about European security. What kind of architecture can we build, given what Putin's done to destroy the post-Cold War structures that we had? Putin has made a series of demands about NATO forces in Eastern Europe, about nuclear weapons. We have to remember about Putin that he isn't a chess player at all. People talk about him as a chess player. He's a Go player. What Go players want is to have as much liberty to do what they want. They want as much flexibility. What we need to think about doing is how do we tie Putin down? How do we have a web of structures that make sure he can't do this again? In the Cold War, we had a whole series of agreements that played that role. We had the CFE, the Conventional Forces Agreement in Europe, which we very unwisely got rid of at the end of the Warsaw Pact. If we had that now, it would be enormously useful in terms of limiting what he could do with his conventional forces. We had INF agreements on intermediate nuclear forces that would be enormously helpful. And we had the Helsinki process, which was much more than the OSCE. It was, again, a web of connections that helped us on human rights and on security. And we need a relationship between NATO and Russia. We can give Putin what he says he wants, we're not actually giving him what he wants at all. The difficult question in all of this is thinking about what a zone of possible agreement could be at the end of this process. There clearly isn't any zone of possible agreement at the moment, but what are we going to do if we get to the stage where there is a mutually hurting stalemate, where neither side can advance? I think we have to start thinking about that and thinking about what the possible answers are. The elements we need to think about are this issue of neutrality, which President Zelensky has agreed to explore. Ukraine clearly isn't going to join NATO or the EU soon, so it would be mad to fight about that, but we're not going to give Putin a veto over that membership. How do we square that circle in an eventual negotiation and agreement? In terms of sphere of interest, we're not going to agree that Ukraine should be forced into a sphere of interest of Russia. But what can we do to reassure Russia in those circumstances? And what are we going to do about the territory the Russians will by then occupy? And what are we going to do about sanctions and about ensuring the sovereignty? Leaving aside the questions of justice for the war crimes that are clearly being committed at the moment. Are we just going to turn a blind eye to those, or are we going to do something about them and the compensation that should be paid? In conclusion, it is possible that Putin will win, but if he does win in terms of actually military might and defeating the Ukrainian army, if he does, there will be a guerrilla warfare that will go on for a long period of time, and he will be stuck, and there will have to be some negotiation to resolve the problem. The danger is that we in the West, committed as we are now, lose interest and move on, which is clearly what Putin hopes will happen. It is possible that the Ukraine will succeed, that the cost will just be too high for Putin domestically and internationally, and he will withdraw. If that happens, I imagine he will befall the same fate as Milosevic after the defeat in Kosovo, when the people of Serbia overthrew Milosevic. The same thing would happen to Putin, I think. But I think most likely what we will see is going to be, and tragically for the Ukrainian people, a combination of pressure, military pressure that the Ukrainian people have applied and we are not applying, the economic pressure, the sanctions that really do have a bite, and the impact of political isolation. And we have to, as with that cornered rat, make sure we have a way out that he will take if we can apply enough pressure. It may not be a substantive way out. It may not be the zone of possible agreement I described. It may be a process answer. It may be a process that he'd be involved in that would justify him leaving Ukraine or leaving the majority of Ukraine in those circumstances. So the fact that I've been talking about negotiations does not mean that I'm not deeply committed to seeing the people of Ukraine relieved of the outrageous attacks on them and able to maintain its sovereignty. But I think we have to be realistic about how this can end and to think ahead about what the parameters of that negotiation and what that zone of possible agreement could be. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just going to add a few more thoughts on some different topics, as I mentioned, questions that have been asked previously of me, of Jonathan, on some of the same topics and some of the other ones. And I want to start with a question that I get a lot, which is about the prospects of escalation. Could this spiral more out of control than it already has? And often the question is couched from the point of view of spilling outside of Ukraine. So things can escalate, of course, within Ukraine and already have, and faster than most people anticipated, but can it spill beyond that? And I think the answer to that is yes, it absolutely could. Now, there is a somewhat natural buffer that didn't exist in the 1930s and 1940s, early 1940s, which is NATO. You would have to really make some new assumptions about Putin to expect him to decide to attack a NATO country and go to war with NATO. So NATO does provide a buffer, but things can still escalate. And there's a number of things that can maybe happen that would do that, so these are the kinds of things we have to keep an eye on. First of all, not necessarily the highest likelihood, but the refugee crisis already internationalizes this conflict. That's one thing. Cyber warfare, either intentionally or unintentionally spilling beyond the Ukrainian borders. Both of those can happen. You can have escalation within Ukraine that gets to a level that is even more unpalatable than it is right now. If Putin starts to do certain things regards to targeting and killing civilians, that takes it up an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude more than he's doing right now, that would be an escalation that would make people rethink what we should and shouldn't be doing. Related to that is a possibility of the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. I put that as a low probability, but I will tell you that this morning, Jonathan and I, over breakfast, this is not why I invited Jonathan to stay with me, but this morning we were sitting here talking about the likelihood of that event. We had different percentages. Neither one of them were the numbers that you would want to hear. But that is always a possibility. Not a nuclear weapon aimed at the United States, but a tactical nuclear weapon used in the theater of war in which he is currently fighting. Then there is a possibility a very strong possibility that Putin decides to attack Moldova or Georgia, which are not NATO countries. That internationalizes it in a different way. There is a possibility that Belarus ups its involvement and role. And at some point, the Ukrainian government decides that in order to resist, in order to defend itself, it needs to attack on the Belarus side of the border to try and do something about those attacks. That internationalizes it as well. And I will say that all of these, and there must be other examples as well, are all still within the set of assumptions we normally make about what Putin wants and doesn't want. If our theory of who Putin is and what he's willing to do, the sort of cornered rat aspect of it, then we have other problems to worry about as well. But even within our assumptions, our reasonably sound assumptions about what Putin would want and not want, there's a possibility of escalation. And we should be thinking now about every one of those situations and what we would and wouldn't do, not just as the United States or any one country, but as the so-called Western alliance. That is something that we should do now, not when it happens. A second point I want to touch on is sanctions. I think it was debatable. Reasonable people could disagree about whether sanctions should have been employed prior to the invasion by Russia, or whether they should have been a wait, which is what happened. I can tell you that when I net out the pros and cons, I would have been in favor of waiting rather than imposing sanctions right before the invasion. But what I think is less debatable, or what I feel much more strongly about, is that if Putin was to invade, which he did, then what he should face immediately is wrath of God level of sanctions. Not an incremental approach, not a small approach. And to be perfectly honest, I was not very confident that we'd approach anything like wrath of God level of sanctions. I think what the international community has done so far is much more aggressive than I expected, and I suspect more than Putin expected. And I think that's a good thing. Now, there's a lot of focus on sanctions and NATO unity and European Union support for Ukraine in whichever way it can be provided. But the two factors that are going to be the most important at the end of the day are going to be the resistance that is provided by the Ukrainian people and the extent to which the Russian people support or don't support this as this drags on. Those two are going to be the most important factors, I think, in what happens next, how long it goes, what a final resolution looks like, all the way down the list of things that Jonathan mentioned. But things like sanctions and the ability to keep that pressure on, things like unity among the NATO countries and the European Union and the international community, all of those things influence these two factors: the extent to which the Ukrainians can resist and impose costs on Putin, and the extent to which and the possibility of rejection of Putin's strategy among the Russian people themselves. I think that is the indirect way in which sanctions do the most good, which also introduces the notion of what the business community can do. And as you've probably already seen or heard, more and more businesses are cutting ties, trying to have nothing to do with the Russian economy, the Russian government, consumers in Russia, etc. I think that's a very good thing. I think this is a moment in time where businesses need to step up. And you can justify all sorts of actions as a business leader, but this is the kind of place where if you were to just go to the wall in your boardroom or in your office and just read, here are our corporate values, you'd probably find 2 or 3 or 4 that would make it pretty clear what you should and shouldn't be doing right now. And I think in some ways what businesses can do can outlast what governments can do, because there may come a time when the sanctions regime falls apart. There may come a time when there's disunity. There may come a time when the international community has to make concessions in a negotiation in order to get a deal done that includes removing pressure. But the role of business can last beyond that. And that's something that I think folks at a business school should be thinking about. Which gets us to the notion of time. A lot of this has to do with how long will this take and what will be the ultimate impact. Every strategy, doesn't have to be military strategy, but every strategy has implicitly an optimal time horizon associated with it. There's a time horizon over which it is going to be most effective. In our class on War and Peace, we talk about the Peloponnesian War. We talk about how the strategy that the Athenians had, a defensive strategy, was a great idea and a great strategy, but it assumes that the war will only last 1 or 2 or 3 years. And if that assumption holds true, your strategy is pretty effective. But if that assumption falls apart, if things drag on longer, that same otherwise reasonable strategy is no longer an effective strategy. Something similar is happening with Putin. His strategy is most effective when things go quickly, when the war ends quickly, when he creates a new normal quickly. And to the extent that that is not happening, that is not helping Putin. I agree with Jonathan. I think the mistake sometimes is to think of the other side as some mad genius. I think it is as perhaps dangerous to underestimate your opponent as it is to overestimate your opponent. Putin is not a genius. I think he's made mistakes. I think he's been surprised by what's happened, by how the international community has responded, how the Ukrainian people have responded. I'm sure he's shocked and has trouble sleeping at night with how much he's made Zelensky an international hero. He's making mistakes. But just because you make mistakes and you find out your strategy didn't work doesn't always mean you change your strategy. Sometimes it means you double down, you start escalating. And again, you get to the trapped in the corner aspect of this. And you can start working on a strategy of brinkmanship and doubling down and doing things that on day one you didn't yourself plan to do. Something that we need to think about as well. I will say, though, even though we might say Putin made some mistakes, it is way too early to judge what's going to happen. The fact that we may have thought that Russia could have taken over Kyiv in 2 days, or Putin may have thought that, and now it's been a week and it hasn't happened, at the end of the day will mean nothing. Because if it ends up taking 2 or 3 weeks, 6 months from now, a year from now, nobody's going to sit here and saying, well, but it took more days than we expected. So although there's a lot of energy and sort of, I don't want to say enthusiasm in a positive way, but hope that maybe this means this is going to be settled in a different way, it's way too early to tell what's going to happen on that. The U.S. Invasion of Iraq in the first Persian Gulf War took 2 to 3 weeks, but nobody sits here and says it took too long. That's not the narrative that's going to win the day. Which gets us a little bit to what Putin's strategy might be. Now, it's hard to know exactly what his strategy is, but you can think about it in somewhat more general terms. You can sort of, how do we conceive of it rather than what is it? I think from a substantive point of view, as I said earlier, I think the strategy initially was to get a quick victory and then establish a new normal and then work from there. Conceptually, it's more of what the French general Berset would say, a plan with branches. It's a plan with branches. We're going to keep some optionality, and this goes to the Go example as well. Keep some optionality, try different things. If I can get this, I take it. If I can't get this, I at least get this. So it's not as rigid as we might think. And finally, I think what's pretty clear about what Putin is doing, again, without knowing the precise specifics of it, is that when he ends up, he wants to make sure he looks good, so he controls the optics. He cares a lot about making sure that he's negotiating from a position of excess, so he has room to give. He has room to sort of say, okay, well, here's what I really want, and sure, I can make these concessions that I don't care so much about, so he wants to negotiate from a position of excess. And he wants to end up in a place where the next time he does something, he's positioned to do it. So I think he's going to be thinking about all of these things. So the first part of the optics is where the exit ramp aspect comes in. How do we give this person an exit ramp who's trying to make sure that the optics are good? But there's these other two things that we have to be thinking about as well. Is this deal going to be a deal that puts him in better position to do the thing he wants to do 2 years from now, 4 years from now, or 6 years from now? That's an important thing to consider. And finally, on the negotiations themselves, it is easier for Putin to declare victory in the negotiations and walk away from whatever the situation he has left behind, the more easily he can control the narrative back home, which creates a bit of an interesting problem, because the more he is damaged by sanctions, the less support he has internally, the less he can control the narrative as time goes on, the harder it will be for him to look at a deal and say, yes, I can use this and I can spin it in the way that I want to. So there's going to be a trade-off there as well. People talk a lot about what happens if NATO unity or EU unity sort of starts falling apart. Over time, are we going to be able to sustain sanctions and pressure? That is one concern. But I'll tell you where there's another place where that unity is likely to start disappearing. And that is when the negotiations themselves start taking place. Substantive, real negotiations, not the early moves that are going on right now. It is often the case that what the people inside the conflict want, what the Ukrainian government wants or the Ukrainian people need, and what the international community is willing to live with are two different things. There's going to likely be some divergence at that stage. And you have to think about, what do we do in a world where the Ukrainian people or the government is willing to accept X, but we think as an international community we should not want that? Or perhaps, more likely, the international community says we have to accept this, but the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government do not think it's the right deal or the fair deal or the appropriate deal for them. We need to be thinking about that now rather than when it happens, because when you think about it in advance, sometimes you can accommodate it in slightly better ways. And ultimately, I think what's going to happen is that we need to think about the fact that one of the things that's going to be negotiated at the end of this deal is not just going to be what happens in Ukraine, but what happens to these external sanctions. And I'm not a fan of removing these sanctions unless things go back to a much better place than they are right now, but that might not be in the zone of possible agreement. So what you end up with is a situation, and by the way, I don't think it needs to be, the rule should not be, we do not remove the sanctions unless we go to status quo ante, go back to exactly where things were before. The real equation we're trying to solve is, we don't want to remove the sanctions until we've imposed enough costs that Russia's adventure, Putin's adventure, was not worth it. Because that's what sets the precedent. Are we able to impose as much cost so that the next time somebody thinks about doing this, they realize it's not going to be worth doing it, regardless of exactly where you end up at the end of that negotiation? And I think here you have to think a little bit about the broader context. Here, Jonathan and I have had some discussions. We have slightly different points of view on aspects of this, but I think for China, for example, this is a small sample but natural experiment about what happens when you do something like Russia is doing. And I think it will speak to them how the world responds as China thinks about its relationship with Taiwan. It's a different situation. They're going to have to make some adjustments in their calculations. They're not going to be able to copy and paste expectations, but it does speak to those things. So as somebody who does not want these kinds of things to happen more broadly, I would want to be the kind of person who says, listen, these sanctions, they need to be kept for longer, more costs need to be imposed, we need to be thinking about that. But I'll finish just by saying this. It is easy for me to say. It is not my brother or sister who is getting killed. It is not my child who's going to fight. It is not my spouse who I'm not going to ever see again. This comes back to the people of Ukraine. We might be able to say we should zoom out and then think about what is a right and wrong answer in this negotiation. We need to zoom out and think about what kind of precedents we may be setting. And I think that is part of the dispassionate analysis. But we must always come back to then also thinking about how easy it is for us to say, sitting here on this stage, what other people should do when it's their family that's under attack. And so we need to think about how to bridge that as well. With that, we're going to stop our discussion points from our point of view, and we're going to take questions from the audience. If they're going to show up here, so it'll take me a second just to, okay. Okay, so the question that's coming in, and we'll just figure out which one of us is going to answer or whether we can answer it. What is the likelihood that Putin will begin to face resistance from within the military? I assume within his own military. Some of the media coverage has highlighted both the logistical weakness, and the rest of the question is not there. So what is the likelihood that Putin will... okay, so Jonathan, do you have some thoughts on the likelihood that internally there's going to be dissent, not just among the Russian people, but at the level of the government or the military?
Yeah, I'll make it slightly wider than just the military, but the bizarre session that Putin had in St. Catherine's Hall in the Kremlin with his security people was a sign. I think he intended it to be a sign of dipping each one of their hands in blood. It actually illustrated that they were pretty uncomfortable with what they were being asked to do. And Gerasimov, the commander of the army who was supposed to be this military genius with asymmetric warfare, seems to have turned out to be not such a great logistician since he forgot to take any fuel and money and food with him for his troops. It seems to be working out quite badly. I think it is almost certain that the military are unhappy with what's happened, unhappy with what they're being asked to do. But the notion there's going to be a Stauffenberg plot where they actually remove Putin is quite hard to imagine. And the problem with this being in a wider sense in the Russian public is, of course, 4/5 of the Russian public still get their news through TV, state television, and not online and elsewhere. I think it's really worth making an effort to try and get the reality of what's happening in Ukraine to the Russian people. The BBC World Service has started a whole series of new frequencies since they're being jammed by the Russians, including shortwave. That will get to some people. If we could get some really effective stuff online, that would be effective. One of the things the Ukrainians have done, which I think is imaginative and makes a difference, is what they've done with Russian mothers. They've set up websites and other ways of trying to get to Russian mothers so they can find out what's happened to their sons, if their son has been captured or killed. And they've actually had the sons call up their mothers, the ones who have been captured, to talk to them about it. And that can get through to the Russian people in a way that other things can't. In the end, Putin doesn't worry a lot about Russian public opinion because he has it under control. But if this becomes a complete disaster, and as they feel the pain of sanctions, then there will be a sentiment. And it may reflect itself, not just in the army, but in the security establishment as a whole. But I think if we pin our hopes on that, that would be a mistake. We should try and engineer it so it's more likely to happen, but I don't think we can ever count on it.
Great. We'll take the next question. I'll start with this one, and then you can add in. This is one where we might have slightly different perspectives, but I'll try to touch on that as well. Could you elaborate on the potential role of China in the conflict and what their preferred outcome would be? China has long been on the side of more stability is good internationally, but I think the difference here is I think what China cares a lot about is internal stability. They don't like the idea of there being any colored revolutions anywhere else because their big concern is the kinds of things that can go wrong internally in China, whether that is in Xinjiang, whether that is in Tibet, or from their point of view, Hong Kong or Taiwan. What they want to do is for there to be internal stability, which is why I personally believe that what is happening with an invasion of a country by another country, Russia going into Ukraine, is not in their set of things that they worry about most. If anything, what they're hoping to see, I think, is that when the smoke clears, the amount of damage done to Russia is limited. I think that is the kind of thing that would give them much more hope, especially since they probably correctly believe that the amount of damage we can do to China economically as an international community that might be unhappy with an invasion of Taiwan is much less than we can do with Russia. So I think what they would want, I can't pretend to know whether they would have wanted this thing to happen or not, but I think where things are today, I think what they're looking for is an outcome that gives them a little bit more solace, that at the end of the day, nobody's going to fight a superpower for too long. People will forget about this going forward. Jonathan, you want to add, subtract, agree, disagree?
Just very briefly, I think the speculation about China as a mediator is pretty misplaced. I don't see how they could be regarded as neutral between the two sides, although, of course, they would have more influence on Putin than any other power. I think they are probably fairly uncomfortable with what's happening. I don't think invading another country is something that they think applies to Taiwan. They think it's their own country. I suppose Putin thinks Ukraine is. But I don't see that they see this as a role play for what they're going to do. I think they don't like this kind of instability. And I think it is their pressure, probably, that's getting Putin to agree to negotiations tomorrow and earlier this week. I think that they're saying you've got to look like you're trying for negotiations even if you aren't actually doing it. And that's why he's sending people to talk, which would not otherwise be his instinct to do.
Yeah, I will just add that it was the Chinese, I don't know if it was a foreign minister or somebody in the government who came out today or yesterday making the point when they were asked about is the situation in Ukraine like the situation in Taiwan. He said, no, they're totally different because Taiwan is sort of part of China. But I think if Putin was standing next to him, he would have said, wait a second, that's our thing too. So I think that there is this issue. The question in front of us is, can you speak to the deneutralization of such countries as Sweden and Switzerland and what that means for geopolitics moving forward? Jonathan, you want to start?
Yeah. I mean, the neutrality of Sweden and Finland and Ireland is slightly anomalous because they're all members of the EU. And it's quite hard to believe we wouldn't fight to defend Finland and Sweden, even though they're not in NATO. The fact that what Putin has done has pushed them to actually contemplate applying for NATO is one of the many counterproductive results of what he's actually trying to do. I don't think it would have the impact on Switzerland. Switzerland's neutrality is of a rather different nature and goes back a very long time, and it's not under threat because it's buried within the EU and NATO more generally. So what it does raise is the question of what neutrality means. And that's, I think, is why Zelensky probably has offered to discuss what neutrality might mean. If neutrality meant being Finland, i.e. in the EU but not in NATO, that might well be something that Ukraine would like. The problem with that is that I don't think the EU is ready to have Ukraine inside, despite what the European Parliament voted on yesterday. So I think when the smoke clears from some of this stuff and we start seeing the rearrangement of our post-Cold War furniture, that change in the nature of neutrality will be an interesting thing, particularly if we can use that concept to find a comfortable place for Ukraine to sit, because it is not believable that Ukraine is going to join NATO or the EU in the short term. But if it has that possibility of joining the EU, I would guess, and that was considered to be neutrality. I doubt that Putin would welcome that. Indeed, 2014 started exactly because the Ukrainian government started down a path with the EU that Putin disapproved of. But if that was a way forward of squaring this circle, that would be extremely encouraging.
Right. We have this question. It's not fully here, but I think we get the gist of it. The Russian narrative is that the West has lied to them over the past 20 years and that NATO has betrayed them. A lot of people in Russia buy that narrative, and then the rest of the question is not there, but I think we can sort of get to this. I mean, there's certainly no doubt that there is this counter-narrative, and that Russia has, and every country has, legitimate security concerns. And every country has a sense of which aspects of history are to be weighted most and are most relevant today. And so if you're from a country which has been invaded from the West 3 or 4 times in the last couple of centuries, it's not hard to imagine that you feel that in the long run that's a legitimate security concern that you have. And I think that it is not only possible to, but reasonable to accept another party, even somebody you're fighting with, their legitimate security concerns. Because if you don't, then you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to fuel the conflict rather than try to address it in the long run. Having said that, just because somebody has legitimate security concerns, it does not license somebody to do anything they want about the security concerns. If I have legitimate security concerns about my neighbor, it does not give me the license to nuke them the next day and say, well, I was able to do that because I had legitimate security concerns. I think what Russia has done, the problem here is that what they have done in order to resolve those concerns goes beyond a certain line that I think in the world as it is today, it would be unacceptable and is being perceived as unacceptable. I think that's the big issue here.
Because one thing that I worked on the CSC negotiations in the 1980s and then the 2+4 German unification negotiations in late 80s, early 90s. And I think we made a mistake in the end of the Cold War. We had an opportunity to hug the Russians tight, and we didn't do it. We started down the track with NATO-Russia relationship. Many of the reasons that didn't work are to do with Russia itself, but we should have tried much harder to make the Russians feel that they were still a great power, that they were still at the top table, rather than dismissing them as upper volta with nuclear weapons. So that was a missed opportunity that we made, but that has absolutely no bearing on him claiming that there is a threat on him from Ukraine at the moment. It's nonsense to suggest, as he started to try and do recently, that there's a nuclear threat. When Russia was one of the signatories to the Budapest Agreement, which was when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees, which Russia is clearly breaching at the moment. So I don't actually accept he's got any legitimate security concerns, but I do think we made some quite serious mistakes, 90s and the 2000s.
Our next question seems pretty popular. What are some feasible, quote, off-ramps that the West could offer and Putin would accept? I'll start with a couple of thoughts on this. They may not be the most satisfying, but I'll try to put a little bit of framework or architecture on how I would think about it. It's also something that Jonathan and I spent some time this morning discussing and sort of trying to make sense of. The category that it will not come from, the off-ramp will not come from anything related to sanctions or the economics of the situation. Why? Because those weren't in place before he invaded, so that's not going to be an off-ramp. He can't declare a victory when it's about, see, I got the sanctions taken off. Well, the sanctions only came on because of what you did. So that cannot be the category from which the victory speech will be written, where the exit ramp will come. It doesn't mean that negotiations on sanctions will not feed into the negotiations and create a package that might be acceptable. That is almost certainly going to be negotiated. But that is not where the exit ramp specifically lies. Nor do I suspect, now again, there's always gradations here. The second category is the parts of Ukraine that he controls. If he gets the so-called LPR or DPR, the Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, if he takes control of those, or Crimea, he could get an exit ramp if the Ukrainians are willing to, and the international community is willing to, accept those as free countries, republics, or part of Russia. The problem is that might not be an exit ramp because it may not be acceptable to the Ukrainian people. What that leaves is a third category. Well, there's probably other categories, but a third major category, which is what Putin was talking about most when he was trying to negotiate, perhaps not in good faith, prior to the invasion, which is about Ukraine's future in NATO, out of NATO, drifting westward, not drifting westward, neutral, not neutral. The exit ramp likely, and it'll have to be a creative solution that includes a process and time, and will be determined a little bit by how much leverage each side has at that moment. But I think it'll be in that area where the exit ramp is most likely to be found. And here I'll borrow a little bit from Jonathan's point earlier. If you're in a situation where Ukraine isn't joining NATO tomorrow or a year from now or 5 years from now or the EU, to be fighting over that and killing so many people and to destroy so much doesn't seem reasonable, which means that might be a way to focus your attention on what can we do with this in a way that everybody can live with and allows us to de-escalate. That would be my attention, and we'd have to think more, but the reason you can't think too much more about it and get more detailed about it is I'm not sure what Zelensky is thinking. I'm not sure what the Ukrainian people are willing to accept. I'm not exactly sure what has been discussed behind closed doors. So you can't get necessarily too nuanced. Jonathan, you want to add something? Or
yeah, I think the key, I mean, this is in many ways the central point and something that people need to spend really a lot of time thinking about. Because, as I said, the dilemma is we don't want to reward Putin for his aggression by giving him a way out, but we also need to think about his victory speech, if you like. How does he explain that he is going to stop killing people and the damage that he's done? What was it for? So we have to try and think how he can justify that. And the point that Deepak's making is that the zone of possible agreement, this way out, is not static. There is no acceptable way out at the moment that Putin could live with politically or the Ukrainians could accept. But over time, as political facts change, then the ZOPA is dynamic. The zone of possible agreement will change. So we may be able to find one. And we need to think imaginatively about what that might be. My own feeling is that since I can't see a substantive ZOPA, in other words, I can't see something you can do to constrain Ukraine that would ever be acceptable to the Ukrainians as a way of stopping Russian aggression, maybe it's about a process. Maybe it's finding a process that's enough for Putin to say, I can stop fighting now because I'm going to be able to achieve what I want through this process of negotiation. At the moment, he's still stuck at setting an ultimatum. When he turns up at the talks tomorrow, that's what he will do. But as the pain increases, if we can increase the pain on him, then maybe he will take that off-ramp at that stage.
I'm going to go to a slightly different kind of question for a moment and then return to some other ones that I see that have popped up near the top as well. What do you think is the bar for any sort of military invention by NATO? It seems that a tactical nuclear strike in this theater of war would be sufficient, ... I assume that means, what? I think there's more space. So that might be the whole thing. I'll go to this because this is something that is clearly being discussed, and I'm going to presume that the question is, it seems that a tactical nuclear strike by Putin in this theater would be sufficient. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to ask Jonathan to start because we had this conversation this morning. I want you to say what you had to say, and then I'll perhaps add to it. If a nuclear, and again, just to be clear, what we mean, a tactical nuclear strike, this might not be everybody's area of study. What we think of a tactical nuclear weapon is what back in the day was just called an atomic bomb. A Hiroshima-sized bomb is today considered a tactical nuclear weapon. It is much smaller than the kind of damage we can actually do with thermonuclear bombs and nuclear devices and such, which can do 100 to 1,000 times more damage than a Hiroshima-sized bomb. A tactical nuclear weapon is also something that people plan to, expect to, and might use in a theater of war. Rather than putting it on an intercontinental ballistic missile and sending it across the ocean, a tactical nuclear weapon would be launched close by in the battlefield where you yourself are not necessarily thousands of miles away. The question is, what happens if Russia, if Putin, trapped, looking like he's failing, or in some other way pressured, decides to cross that line?
Yeah, the problem is this, that Russian military doctrine, tactical nuclear weapons are integrated into conventional war strategies. So their formations will actually have the possibility of using these small nuclear weapons that are used, relatively small. They're not launched by rockets, but are actually just used in the battlefield. They can even be used as sort of not closing tunnels and things like that. So would we go to war if you used one to close a tunnel somewhere rather than destroy a city? I doubt it. And then you enter into the slight illogic of our position as the West, that we were prepared to fight for Kuwait when it was invaded by Iraq, and we sent a massive force to fight for it. They weren't members of NATO, and yet we fought for them, but we're not prepared to fight for Ukraine. That's a decision the American administration has made. So what would provoke it to change that and actually risk a nuclear war by going into a war with Russia? So I think it would depend, in a rather grisly fashion, on what the tactical nuclear weapon was used for. If it was used to destroy a large center of population, then I think it would be very difficult for us not to think that is a bridge that had been crossed. Were it used for something more prosaic that didn't kill people and didn't poison a huge area of land for a long period of time. It is, of course, problematic for Putin, too. If he's embracing the Ukrainian people, who are in fact Russian people, he tells us, and their land, Kievian Rus, then actually destroying it with a nuclear weapon for the foreseeable future also seems slightly counter to logic, but then that depends on whether he's still in the realm of logic.
And just to follow up on something, if Putin decides to use a tactical nuclear weapon, even in the context of killing a lot of Ukrainian people, would you advise a response that includes a nuclear strike of any kind?
I wouldn't advise a nuclear. No, I mean, I would not advise a nuclear strike in those circumstances, but I would advise military action. Yes. Great.
I just want to make that distinction about what we're talking about here, and I will tell you that there are people who disagree with that, who feel like at some point you need to be able to retaliate enough to put pressure on the other side and act as a deterrent from what happens next. And I will tell you that I understand that logic. I also lean very much in the direction of Jonathan on this. Yes, you would need to consider military action. There's a real problem if anybody uses a nuclear weapon, which is that for the last 70 years, nobody's done it, over 70 years. To normalize that even a little bit, even if it's a small tactical nuclear weapon, crosses a line that makes it easier for somebody else to cross the line next time. If it happens, there's still one other line, which is, did the other side retaliate with nuclear weapons and that it did spiral out of control? That is also something that can become normalized. To the extent that that can be resisted, it is crucial. Not only because of will things escalate out of control in this war, but will it normalize for the next time somebody's considering doing this, something that we are trying to make sure we never go down the path of. The last thing I'll say about this is, if you're Putin, it seems irresponsible. Well, everything he's doing seems irresponsible, but it seems a little bit ridiculous to be talking about using nukes. But just keep in mind, it also helps him if it seeds doubt in our mind about his willingness to do that. So the more he feels, makes us feel that, oh my God, he might use nukes, the more it might make us want to resist less or put less pressure on. It's a double-edged sword. You don't want to fall prey to that strategy. At the same time, there's always some truth to the fact that somebody might escalate in ways you didn't expect. So we have to kind of be very, very mindful of this. And again, if I'm advising any of the administrations that are relevant to this, I want them to have that conversation right now, if they haven't already had it, about exactly what we would do under these situations, which currently seem unthinkable. Because when you wait till the unthinkable happens, it is often too late to get a coordinated response, to send the right message with your response, to be able to think clearly about it, and that's not what we want to be what we want to be doing. Jonathan, I'm going to throw this out there. I think you're going to have to answer this one rather than me.
Iraq one, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Do you feel, and I'm pretty sure that you is you, do you feel that Iraq invasion under false pretenses during your time as Chief of Staff for Tony Blair set a precedent for autocrats like Putin to try to legitimize their actions? Do we in the West have double standards when it comes to invading sovereign states?
Well, I'll answer the easy bit first and then the harder bit second, which is clearly we have double standards. I just described in the case of Kuwait that what's the distinction between Kuwait and Ukraine is that it's got an awful lot of oil, I guess. I'm not here to try and defend and pretend that the invasion of Iraq was a great success, of which anyone should be proud. I think it is a bit of a distraction to suggest that that's a good excuse for Putin to invade his neighbor. And I do think the comparison I gave earlier of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, because he thought it was really part of Iraq and historically had been part of Iraq, is a better comparison where we did then go and fight him, and we're not prepared to go and do that for Ukraine. So I think muddling them up, our invasion of Iraq, which is, I would be happy to defend at length if you wish, but I don't think is terribly relevant to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. I think that other parallel is more applicable.
Great. I will just add about the double standards things. There are double standards everywhere. In the response of NATO, in the response of the EU, in the response of the United States in a lot of places. In our decision to do this discussion today, which I started out by saying is a really great thing because as students at HBS and other people who are interested in joining, it's a testament to the fact that we're not turning away, we're not too distracted to care about what's happening in the world, that we should be doing these things. I think it's important. But it's also a reminder that we don't always do this. And there are people suffering in a lot of parts of the world. And we don't always find the time and the energy to convene. Yes, this is different in some ways because it looks a little bit more like World War III than anything we've come close to. But a lot of people are dying in a lot of different places. And so maybe we should just reflect on that as well and think about whether we should be doing more of such conversations, not just to support the students that are here, but to prepare all of us as we go forward and deal with a world that's much more diverse than the ones that we tend to pay more attention to. So that's, and I'd be happy to be engaged in all of those. Next question. Why now? And what do you think is Putin's ideal outcome at this point? Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? Either way.
Yeah, happy to start. So I think what Putin is still hoping is that although he's had these setbacks, his expectations have been disappointed, that he will prevail. He'll do what he did to Grozny. He'll do what he did to Aleppo and destroy these cities and the people living in them, and that he will overcome the opposition of the Ukrainians and subdue them, and that they will give up and there won't be a guerrilla campaign, and that West will get bored and move on and relax the sanctions. That's what he's hoping will happen. And I think he's living in a sufficiently parallel universe that he still thinks that. And he could be right. I hope he isn't, but it's not inconceivable that that's what happens to us.
Yeah, I would just add the why now is always very hard because everything that's led up to today could be a potential reason we say why now. So it's very hard to sort of do the experiment, have the counterfactual in a clean way. But some of the factors that I think are probably relevant, if you're going to make a decision like this, you're on some level rationally or quasi-rationally thinking about costs and benefits. And a big question is going to be how is the world going to respond? And I think if you think that NATO or the Western Alliance is disunited, they are unlikely to be able to muster the will. If Germany has certain concerns economically that will make them not want to act a certain way, if the U.S. has lost its ability to build a coalition around this, or the Europeans have lost their ability, everything that's fed into that, you could include anything you wanted, and I wouldn't be able to judge right or wrong, whether it's Brexit happens, whether it's Trump's relationship with NATO allies, whether it's reliance on Russian oil or gas. Anything that makes him think increasingly that this is something where he's not going to suffer as many consequences makes it more likely. People have internal problems. People are worried about the economics of the situation. We're just coming out of COVID. A lot of those things, hard to tease apart, but I think there's something to that. And I think that's ideal outcome. I sort of agree on variations of what Jonathan said. Ideal outcome for him is he takes Ukraine, he takes Moldova, he takes Georgia, but I don't think that's what he went in here thinking about. Ideal for him, I think, was just making sure that he has a much, much stronger presence in Ukraine, and he eliminates any possibility of Ukraine moving to the West, and that he looks wonderful, and that the costs are limited. And then when he wants to do something the next time, he's in better position to do it. I think that is perhaps some composite of what he might be thinking. I don't have a good answer to this. Jonathan, if you do, about the Russian oligarchs, I'll ask
you read it.
Yeah, so how influential are the largest Russian oligarchs in Putin's decision-making, as they are likely acutely impacted by Western sanctions? I know the last part is yes, but I'd love for you to think about or share anything you have about the Russian oligarchs and Putin's decision.
Well, Abramovich is clearly affected by it since he's put Chelsea football team on the market today, and says he's giving the money to charity when it's sold, and he's also offering to mediate. So he's clearly been impacted. It's interesting when Putin called he announced he was calling the oligarchs to read them the riot act, but actually what he did was he invited the leaders of the state enterprises. So they weren't oligarchs at all. These were sort of employees of Putin's, and gave them the lecture, not the oligarchs themselves, which is significant because he's perfectly happy to call oligarchs in and dress them down. So I think he has got a real problem with the oligarchs who will be saying disagreeable things. Even Friedman, although he's not going anything like as far as one would want, is denouncing this stuff, and particularly some of the children of these oligarchs, which again will have an impact on them when their children start saying these things. He's got a significant problem with the oligarchs. They're not going to be the people who bring him down, and the earlier question about the military was probably more likely on the right track for that. But the combination of the elite, the oligarchs, and people in the military and the intelligence services together, feeling this has just gone too far, this guy has led us down the garden path, is probably the best hope of him being deposed.
Right. What are the chances that the wrath of God sanctions, that seems to be quoting me, backfire and spur Russian nationalism similar to excessive reparations put on Germany between World War I and World War II? I'll give a couple of thoughts on this, and then, Jonathan, you can add as well. There is always a chance that any strategy you have could backfire. So yes, there's always a possibility. Now the question is, what makes the situation different or similar to the ones that we're worried about? You have to remember that even after the Napoleonic Wars, or if you didn't know, you're not remembering it, but one thing that's interesting is even after the Napoleonic Wars, when reparations were made against the French, they weren't actually imposed against France in the initial negotiations. What happened was Napoleon had been kicked out and imprisoned, and France was invited into the negotiations, and they had a reasonable negotiation. We're going to go back to the old borders, and everything's going back to the way it was. It's because the French were able to say it was Napoleon, not the rest of us. The problem is when Napoleon escaped from prison, went back into France, and was treated as a hero, and people started to march along with him again, now they're like, okay, now you're getting reparations. Because this is apparently not about Napoleon, it's about all of you. We're in a similar situation to that now. I think most people believe and want to believe and hope that this is Putin's war. And this is not about us against the Russian people. That doesn't mean there's not a belief that the Russian people believe a certain narrative. They have a different point of view than we do. There's propaganda and there's genuine beliefs that are different. The hope would be that when the smoke clears, and again, it's still early. This is not about reparations for the next 10 years or 15 years. When the smoke clears, whether it's in weeks, months, or a year or so, it'll be possible to try and identify whether it's available as an option to thread that needle. If Putin has been kicked out for some reason, it makes it very easy to move in a different direction. If not, then you have some judgments to make. How much are we hurting the average person? What are we getting out of it? And then that can be reassessed. At this stage, I'm not worried about that, because at this stage, we're trying to solve a short-term problem, trying to put enough pressure to perhaps change the calculation in Ukraine and in Russia. I am not worried that that will lead to this long-term consequences of what the German narrative became after World War I. But we can reassess that after we get past the short-term period and see what we want to do next.
Just very briefly on that one, I think the difference between reparations and sanctions is that reparations hurt one way, i.e. they hurt Germany. Sanctions hurt us. Not as much as they hurt Russia, but they hurt us too. And therefore, we will be trying to get rid of them as quickly as we can, whereas reparations led to a further conflict. I think that's the major difference.
Great. What, if anything, can NATO, EU, USA do to reduce the toll on Ukrainian civilians without risking wider escalation? I'll just make one point about it, and then I'll let you go, and then if I have anything to add. I'll just mention something that has been discussed in the media. There's some people who have been supportive of it. I am not. I don't think, I'm sure Jonathan is not either. What you don't want to do, I believe, is set up a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Setting up a no-fly zone is essentially stepping into the war. And you should only do that if you're willing to go to war in Ukraine over Ukraine, which currently the U.S. government and others do not want to do. A no-fly zone is not just an announcement you make and then everybody says, oh, no-fly zone, okay, I won't fly here. It is just steps away from a confrontation. And one of the things that can allow things to spill over is a NATO or EU aircraft gets shot down, and now you are clearly an escalation zone. So, but the problem is, if you don't have a no-fly zone, that limits very much what the U.S. or NATO or the EU can do in support of the Ukrainian people, especially if Kyiv or other cities are under siege. And things are getting worse, and that this is lasting a long time. Jonathan can speak more to the idea of a humanitarian corridor that's being discussed, and he has some more details on that, perhaps. But there's going to be limits to what can be done. Yes, there's ways to send money and such things, but at some point, money in itself becomes less valuable because the economy is not working the way you want to.
I mean, the obvious military thing would be being discussed today is providing planes for the Ukrainians. The Russians still haven't gained air dominance. Ukrainians can still fly. There are dogfights over Kiev today. And the EU countries are looking at whether they can provide planes, because what they want to provide with planes the Ukrainians can fly, so MiG-29s is what they would be able to do. And I very much hope they go ahead with that. The problem is, of course, getting them there and so on. But that's a concrete military thing you could do. One thing I really feel very strongly about is this question of a humanitarian corridor. The last UN convoy left Kiev today. There won't be any more. The UN has been asking Russia to allow there to be a humanitarian corridor every day for the last week or so, and the Russians are refusing to engage. And there is no reason why the West, the international community more generally, should not put pressure on the Russians to allow such a humanitarian corridor between Kiev and the border, and probably between and for other cities too, so people can leave rather than sheltering and facing annihilation in these bombardments by multiple rocket launcher systems. It really seems to me something that's beholden on us to make that happen.
Right. How can the U.S. and Europe protect President Zelensky, and what would it mean for the resistance if he was captured? First of all, I think there's very little we can do to protect him. I think many of you, if not all of you, have perhaps heard about his response when he was offered the opportunity to leave Ukraine. Maybe this is just the way he thinks. Maybe it's the fact that he knows how to say a line, but it was, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And he has chosen to stay. And once you choose to stay, and you're an individual and you're in a war zone, I think there's very little you can do to protect the person. It's hard to predict what happens if he is captured, because you can imagine things going in either direction. My instinct is that it would not be an end to the resistance, it would probably fuel the resistance, but I cannot know that. I am not a Ukrainian in Ukraine. I don't know what the sentiment exactly around it is. I think it could go in either direction, but I think it could actually fuel the resistance further. But there's no way I can predict that. Jonathan?
I don't think the Russians intend to capture Zelensky. I think they intend to kill him if they find him. And what they'll do is they'll create a martyr that will keep this going for much longer.
Yeah. What is the likelihood of Ukraine being accepted into the EU during or after this war? Jonathan?
Well, Ukraine filed an application yesterday. European Parliament voted overwhelmingly to accept Ukraine into the EU, and I think there's no chance of them being accepted into the EU in the foreseeable future. It's a pity. I mean, Tony Blair, interestingly, after the Kosovo War, went to Romania and announced we should expedite the Eastern European countries coming into the EU, and many EU governments still blame him for doing that because he said they weren't ready, we shouldn't have had corrupt, fragile democratic systems into the EU. But actually it's been a huge boon for those countries and was the right thing to do, and I wish we'd done it for Ukraine earlier.
Yeah, and I'm trying to jump around a little bit just to get different angles of questions as well.
Can I take that second one?
Yeah. Do you think this marks a turning point, that one?
Yeah.
That one just jumped into second place. Do you think this marks a turning point for the new returning role of the EU as an active player in global geopolitics?
Amongst the many counterproductive things that Putin has done is he has created, firstly, a completely new Germany, and secondly, a new EU. It's not just a temporary unity that he's imposed on them, but he's actually changed German policy in a fundamental way that won't go back again. Germany has never been prepared to provide weapons to countries in conflict zones. It's never been prepared to increase its defense spending in the way that it's agreed to do now. So Putin obviously had no intention of doing this, but he's made something that is going to be very different indeed. And I do think that we will see the solidarity that's come out of this. Even countries like Hungary, who have been sympathizing with Putin, have actually joined into this. So I think that will be one of the real lasting changes.
There's a question that keeps bouncing up and down. I'll just address it so I don't have to look at it again. Is there any scenario where countries like the U.S. put boots on the ground? I'll say a thing about that. Not in the way we're normally thinking about this, unlikely, in Ukraine, contained in Ukraine. If it spills over everywhere and there's boots everywhere, you never know what happens, but I don't think so. But in a future peacekeeping force, when things have settled down, yes, possible. But there was a scenario where I could have imagined. I could even imagine having advised putting U.S. boots on the ground. That time has passed. But imagine a world where, or think back to when Putin was not inside Ukraine, his army had not invaded, his military had not invaded. There was this question about whether they're going to invade or not. The presumption at the time was if they invade, it's for Luhansk and Donetsk. Of course, there was worries that things nearby, like Kharkiv and others, would be potentially in danger as well. But they hadn't invaded yet. Imagine if the United States and the Allies had put a lot of troops, 10,000, 40,000, 60,000 troops in Ukraine at that point. Not in Luhansk, not in Donetsk, but just outside of that. I think that changes the calculation for Putin because there's a first mover advantage. If we're there, he doesn't want to kill us and escalate to an international war. But if he's there first, we can't go in there and escalate it to an international war. There would be other things to think through, and every strategy is risky. But if you wanted to perhaps build a sort of a resistance point beyond a certain area which the Russian military essentially already controlled, I think if you're thinking strategically, you have to consider that option. I'm not sure it was considered, but from a strategic standpoint, it would have been something that I would have wanted to think about seriously. I don't think we are right now in that situation for the dynamic I just advised.
I don't think, I mean, it may well be why Taiwan has announced there are US troops in Taiwan, and I hope it has that impact. But I don't think there'll be any US boots on the ground in Ukraine. I can't envisage that situation. I think there'll be a hell of a lot more US boots on the ground right along the eastern flank of NATO. So if Putin really was trying to deal with a security threat to him, he's just created a much greater security threat than was there before.
Great. Let's just do one last question. We're at 7:13. I want to respect the time that we had set for this. We'll try this one just because it gets... Which one? Go ahead.
I was going to say the first one probably, because the ones that...
Sure. It might be a longer one, but okay. Yeah. You both mentioned some likely outcomes of the war. Could you please lay out what you think are the most likely ones, their timelines and conditions, signposts? Buy my book. No, this is that's what they do here. Jonathan, since you asked for it.
Right. Well, I don't know, and so my predictions will be wrong. But I can see two outside parameters. One is that Putin does destroy the cities, does declare a victory of some sort, that the resistance gets disheartened, and that he can claim victory, and he can hope that we all forget about it after another year or so, as we have about other conflicts around the world. I think of the people in Myanmar, for example, who are suffering in a similar way, but we do absolutely nothing for. Yeah. So I think he's hoping for that scenario. I don't think it will happen because I think my judgment of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian resistance is such that that interest will maintain. And I also think certainly in Europe, the degree of engagement on this question is such that it won't disappear even in a year or 2 years, that people will remain very engaged. The other extreme possibility is that the Ukrainians do succeed. They have frustrated the Russian forces for a long period of time. They've held them back in the most extraordinary way that you wouldn't have expected. They're going to have troubles of ammunition and so on because getting it into the country is difficult. But they plus we with economic sanctions, etc., raise the cost so high for Putin that there is a reaction inside the country sufficient to make him back down. That's the one I'm sure we all devoutly hope for, and that he suffers the fate of Milosevic in those circumstances. I think the most likely, timescales I can't tell you for any of those, but the most likely one I think is a middle scenario where we get a long-running conflict right on the border of Europe that bleeds and bleeds, and it isn't really a frozen conflict because it's going to keep bleeding. And we will have to work out a way of trying to deal with it, and that is what I think will force us into negotiations in all probability.
I'll just add one other possibility which hasn't been mentioned, but I think is not unlikely. I mean, when you have many options, everything is somewhat unlikely, but it's still significant. We keep thinking about the fact that a negotiated outcome is hard because there's no zone of possible agreement. What they can accept and what we can accept, there's just no overlap. But sometimes, in situations like that, a non-agreement can still be a solution. There is a state of the world where Putin could not accept an agreement that gets him to move out of the cities that he's in, but that he unilaterally announces or decides, really because of the sanctions, the pain, and the ability to still craft a narrative, to then retreat to a certain level, declare his objectives met, spin it a certain way, and still keep forces in some parts of Ukraine that de-escalates. Not because of an actual negotiation, or perhaps slightly because of some diplomatic channels, but not because there's actually an agreement signed. So the idea of having the sanctions there, the idea of doing this, doesn't always mean that the exit ramp comes at the negotiation table with a concession. An exit ramp just needs to exist. It just needs to materialize. It just needs to be found. And if there's enough pain and if there's enough desire to exit, sometimes a party can find it unilaterally. So I wouldn't take that off the table of possibilities at all, especially if we're feeling kind of hopeless about the concept of a, quote, negotiated agreement. We're going to stop this here, and I'm just going to go back to just two things I said at the very beginning. We cannot aspire to, nor will we pretend to have addressed all of these questions or issues in a way that's completely satisfying or partially satisfying. The hope is to at least, as a community, come together and be willing to have this discussion, and to maybe set the stage for having future discussions about things that happen around the world, and make sure that we're taking these things seriously. As Georgi said at the very beginning, there are a lot of students who are thinking about this because it is immediately affecting them personally, their family, their friends, but it affects every one of us because you don't have to be very, very close to the battlefield to care about your fellow human beings and your fellow students. So I hope we'll all sort of continue the conversations. I'm always available as a resource if you have any follow-up questions. Feel free to reach out to me, and hope you're all doing okay, and thank you for attending. Yep.